I'm going to talk today about a red thread that one can draw through a number of projects that I've been doing over the last several years. That's really about sort of spotting a pattern of opportunity in the fact that there's a lot of randomness in social systems, and we can use that randomness for causal inference. So let's see the screen. Oh no, yes, okay. So this is sort of like the opening slide. We have all these social systems that are very complicated. They resemble Rube Goldberg machines in the sort of the style of the classic drawings. But increasingly, we have all these sort of algorithms inside of them. We have these AI components. And I'm not just thinking about sort of recommender systems. That's a classic example where there's sort of human in the loop or machine in the loop dynamics. I'm thinking about also sort of the ways in which in many countries, in many cities in many countries, students are assigned to schools algorithmically according to matching algorithms. Or legal cases are often assigned to judges according to some version of a constrained allocation. In academia, we spend an enormous amount of our time doing peer review. Peer review, certainly in sort of computer science context, it's typically solving a large-scale matching problem between papers and reviewers. And then you have various problems in marketing where you're trying to target an intervention, and that targeting is increasingly done algorithmically. 20 years ago, it was somebody deciding to put in ads in certain magazines. Now it's some sort of big machine learning loop that's deciding how to spend a budget. So one of the better pieces that's been written about this in recent years is this review article from 2021 in Nature that talks about this perspective of the algorithmically infused society. And it argues that, so there's this potato in the middle, which is society, and we have economic processes, social processes, political processes, and increasingly sort of, we'll take economic processes, these sort of like loop over recommender systems in terms of like, it's changed the distribution of sort of the heavy-tailedness of what products succeed in the market, sort of the ways in which online retailers have reformed first, the fact that there's no more brick and mortar, but also the fact that you get feedback loops that sort of concentrate the market towards certain individuals. Social processes, we have sort of dating recommendations that are kind of changing society in a very weird way. I'm just old enough to have missed this feedback loop, but my students tell me it's a big one. And then there's the one that I spent a lot of time studying, but won't talk about so much today, is recommender systems employed, or sort of the targeted distribution of content on social media. So this is feed algorithms, et cetera. I'm happy to talk about that offline with anybody who's interested. But the main point is that 50 years ago, there weren't these algorithmic feedback loops. Now there are these feedback loops. How is society changing is sort of at the heart of a lot of questions that people are asking these days. Institutes like Digital Futures are very centered on questions like that. So the case I want to make today is that there's actually a lot of randomness in these systems, and randomness is basically, and oftentimes enough randomness to interpret that randomness as driving randomized trials. So randomized trials are kind of the gold standard of causal inference, of sort of like understanding causal effects. And because these little algorithmic components contain randomness typically for other reasons, now, there's lots of situations where we have randomness because of explore-exploit trade-offs, where there's sort of like classic reinforcement learning paradigms at play. But a lot of these systems have randomness for other reasons that I'll go through. And my pitch is that we should be looking very carefully for these algorithmic randomnesses to sort of, in order to tell us how to improve the design of these various systems. And so because this is more of an engineering crowd than sort of a social science crowd, I'll do kind of like a broad pitch for the value of randomness in causal inference. Why are people interested in causal inference so focused on randomness? Essentially, it's because you can take a population, roll a dice, flip a coin, and you get two populations, sort of a treatment population, a control population, that are nearly identical in distribution. Sort of you want the fact that if you're going, and then you give, the treatment to one group and the control doesn't get the treatment. And then you compare the outcomes, and the real thing that you're so happy about is the fact that the two populations are nearly identical. It's hard to be identical in high dimensions. This is sort of like what the modern mathematical study of causal inference is trying to work out the kinks of, and it's a very interesting research area for those of you who aren't already in it. But essentially, randomness lets us know the effect of vaccine trials beyond the fact that vaccines were mostly given to old people early on, whereas when you run a randomized trial, you actually know the populations are the same. Same thing sort of outside of medicine, these interventions like bed nets for malaria, and then sort of all of A/B testing online is all sort of harnessing this opportunity. So, of course, this is a very basic principle. It goes back to Fisher and others about 100 years ago. What's been going on with sort of the use of randomness now in algorithmic systems. So this is a paper that just won a Test of Time Award at WWW, or at the Web Conference, which is a large computer science conference. So this is a study from 2010 where there was researchers at Yahoo News, and they were trying to configure a contextual bandit algorithm for targeting news stories to users. They knew things about users, they knew things about news stories. They were trying to figure out what the best way was to match that, how to trade off sort of older news stories versus more recent news stories, breaking news, etc. And what they did was they went and just showed random news stories for a week. This is a pretty bad idea for sort of how to run a news story. Sort of it was completely untargeted, and it also didn't sort of like weight more recent. It was random within a 24-hour window. So they were just showing random news. But then they did that for a week, and then they used that to then use sort of this one weird trick of importance sampling to try to understand what would happen if we had targeted different things. So when you run this for a week on a website like Yahoo, at least 10 years ago, you had sort of millions and millions of impressions. And then what you can do is you can subsample that data and look and say, okay, what if I had run, it was collected under the uniformly at random policy. Here's this idea where I think that selecting things according to maximizing the following inner product is sort of the best idea. Let's look at all the recommendations that did happen that would have happened under my policy. And then we're going to sort of like look at that subsample and look at how well we did. And what would have happened if, here's another algorithm. And you can kind of compare a bunch of algorithms according to these principles of offline policy evaluation or off policy evaluation. So in social systems, we can rarely afford to make decisions uniformly at random, if only for a week. Sort of, you can't say, well, in order to improve school allocations in Stockholm, this year students are going to be assigned randomly. But we'll learn great things like that. That steps across the line of the classic problem of sort of human subject research, that it violates various principles of minimal harm. But fortunately, all these tricks of importance sampling work perfectly well, even when the random system is not uniform. So as long as you have sort of enough randomness so that you can explore, you're able to explore policies that are nearby. And my pitch then is that there's a lot of algorithmic systems that contain sufficient randomness. I'm going to sort of I have one or two more slides at this high level, and then I'm going to dive into several examples. So just to sort of, for those, this is a technical audience, I'm making a pitch for something that is significantly short of full reinforcement learning. So in social systems, designing social systems is hard. Designing experiments in social systems is nearly as hard. And so just to sort of proof by example, so Gary King is a social scientist at Harvard who was involved in the early 2000s with the rollout of Mexico's universal healthcare system. So this is an entire country going from not having universal healthcare to having universal healthcare. And they wanted to use that huge opportunity to study the effect of universal healthcare sort of on various health outcomes. And they said, okay, we're going to roll it out randomly. Like this is a social scientist's dream to do this at the scale of a nation. But then as soon as that plan was sort of put into play, the Mexican politicians that had written the plan said, well, no, you have to understand, I represent Oaxaca and I wrote this bill, and if Oaxaca doesn't get this first, then I'm not going to get reelected. So like, great, I understand you want to understand scientific things, but like Oaxaca gets to be first. And then the Mexico City senator said, whoa, but my district of Mexico City also. So they sort of ended up in this like political bargaining table over like who gets to go first randomly, which is very bad for social science. So they wrote a whole paper about so-called politically robust experimental designs for public policy evaluation, which was about using a combination of randomness and matching techniques, essentially. And it's a whole interesting paper where they're kind of like solving constrained matching problems in order to learn as much as they can about the rollout. So this is my sort of like, if you haven't seen papers like this, experiments in large-scale social systems get or nearly as hard as designing the whole system in and of itself. So I'm not proposing something wild like doing sort of, this dream story of running a bunch of social systems with reinforcement learning loops that are continuously improving and regret minimizing and all such things. I'm just proposing sort of policy evaluation, sort of identifying these sources of randomness and doing offline policy evaluation to improve them. And that's sort of improve them within the paradigm that they exist. And in a lot of these settings, it's going to be very tempting to say, oh, but we could learn a lot more if we just increase randomness a little bit. And that's a political decision. That's sort of like, or how much you prioritize explore versus exploit. And so I'm not even proposing that. I'm actually, part of what I'm trying to argue is that there is sufficient randomness in a lot of these systems to already improve them. So these are great and ambitious thoughts, but I'm sort of going to put those aside a little bit. The last preamble point I'm going to make is that a lot of, in the eyes of causal inference, it's really special that this is real randomness. This is sort of, or at least at the level of pseudo-random number generators. So I'm not going to have that debate. But I'm sort of saying that a lot of causal inference, it's rare to have real experiments in social systems, and you rely on these methods like instrumental variable method, the IV designs, regression discontinuity designs, RDD, matching techniques, propensity modeling, and propensity matching. These techniques all sort of like require assumptions of either sort of like near randomness. So regression discontinuity design says that sort of like people who had grades just above and just below some cutoff are roughly the same people. So if there's some grade cutoff for a scholarship, and you want to know what's the causal effect of a scholarship, you're making, in order to analyze that data and say, oh, there's a randomized experiment here, you're basically saying that the people just below and just above are almost the same, and like it's the cut happens sort of at random, and therefore I can like look at the discontinuity there and measure the effect locally within the population. But there's sort of like, we don't need any kind of like assumptions of near randomness or continuity of the outcome variable, which is sort of like a lot of as these methods have really caught on the last 20 years, particularly in economics, people are also realizing there's sort of like an active litigation of what the assumptions are underlying these various methods, parallel trends assumptions, and there's sort of like a very active debate in the econometrics literature. So we have sort of like real randomness, and I mean at the level of pseudo random number generators. Okay, so the three examples that I want to walk through is I'm going to talk about sort of peer review systems that are increasingly have randomness injected in them to solve fraud problems. I'm going to talk about network seeding problems where we try and maximize the adoption of a product, and we're reaching various versions of random populations, possibly using this idea of friendship paradox targeting. And why do we do it randomly? Because there is an optima to an optimization problem, but it's very, very like computationally inefficient and kind of like work inefficient to use those systems. And then I'm going to talk about school choice systems, which is this situation where we run many countries, many cities run Gale Shapley's deferred acceptance algorithm. And in those systems, there are lotteries. And economists have noticed these lotteries for the last 10 to 15 years, but I think that they can also be used, my argument is that they can also be used for improving the design of school matching algorithms. Are there any questions at this point before I jump into these examples? That was really just so I could drink some coffee. Okay, no questions? Cool. Oh yeah, and there's sort of other cases that I won't really talk about. Judges being matched to cases. There's actually, there's some interesting papers on looking at the fact that there's a lot of medical tests. This is sort of like going back to the home base for causal inference. There's a lot of medical tests where you get referred, they do a blood test, and if your number is above 100, they refer you to a procedure. If it's below 100, they don't. And those are basically thresholding algorithms. And the thing people have been realizing is that these blood tests are noisy. And so they're actually sort of like, there's noise there, there's randomness there. And so some people whose actual blood level is 92 are being referred. Some people whose actual blood level is 110 are being referred. And if you have a good characterization of the noise of the test, you can sort of learn that actually we would, as a medical system, be doing better if we were referring everybody who had who was above 95. Like the value shouldn't be 100. And you can collect that data. Just, you're running a policy of 100, and then you have a good understanding of the noise, and you can sort of like learn new policies, new thresholds that would make things better. So let's talk about peer review. So this is a landscape, a hellscape that many of us live in. So for those of you who haven't, so what I'm going to describe is the primary paradigm for peer review in computer science, which is sort of the conference system. The journal system, where there's associate editors that sort of like recruit reviewers, is more manual, and there's actually a lot to be said for this system, pros and cons. I can give references on sort of like the bigger picture of what makes for a good peer review system is a very, very interesting question. But so in computer science conferences, you have a big stack of papers that get submitted in a given year, and then you have all the people who volunteer to be on the program committee, sort of the reviewers, and then the reviewers bid, typically. So they bid, and you sort of like, oh, this person says, I give the first paper a 3, the second paper a 1, and then I really don't want to review C, so I give it a -1. Sort of everybody fills out their preferences, perhaps sparsely. And then you're actually, the standard way to make assignments is to solve a max flow problem, where you're maximizing the sum of the assigned scores, subject to simple constraints that every paper gets reviewed at least X times, and every person is reviewing at most Y papers. Hopefully it's feasible. Typically, sometimes you find that you have to increase sort of like the number of papers per reviewer to find good matches, et cetera. It depends on how you code, sort of like you can put conflicts in this matrix of like -infinity, and it's a fairly general framework. And so you solve this and you get an assignment. Sort of, okay, so this person's going to review 2 papers, this person's going to review 2 papers. This is typically solved via an LP, and the solution is deterministic. There's an introduced solution based on sort of like standard theory of LPs for max flow. But there's a problem, which is a little bit like very convenient for my purposes. And that's sort of how it came about. But basically, it's been detected that particularly in the CS systems community, some people have maybe heard about this, there are these pretty bad cases of fraud, where there's a circle of people who all bid really heavily on their own papers. And like if you all place those like, I definitely want to review type things, bids, you tend to, with a high sort of probability, get those assignments. And then they do sort of like a back channel, you scratch my back, I scratch your back, cartel. And there's been a number of these that have been detected. They're typically small. They typically like to small groups, so they're not sort of like large cliques or anything. They typically involve people who like moved from one lab to another and then like still know the PhD student that they used to work with. And it's pretty bad. It's really bad. And so as a solution to this problem, there's a team at CMU led by Nihar Shah, who has this great review paper that was in Communications at the ACM, which has been piloting this idea of sort of like bounding the probability that any person gets any paper. And the elegant thing about this modification of the max flow problem, if you're sort of like a technical optimizer, is that it's still an LP, but it just has a fractional solution. And you're basically just adding a constraint such that before you were finding kind of like integer assignments, that some people get the paper, other people don't. Now you're sort of like saying, well, you know, no person is allowed to get any paper with a probability greater than Q, where Q is like 0.5 or something like that. And the purpose of this constraint is to say, basically kind of like reduce the expected value of fraud. And so there's a significant technical detail in this paper that appeared at NeurIPS a few years ago, which is that these types of constraints, which are pairwise, they're sort of dyadic constraints, they make it possible to still sample matchings that satisfy these marginal probabilities using sort of standard Birkhoff-von Neumann algorithm type ideas. So there's a slight generalization of Birkhoff-von Neumann theorem that they use to construct these matchings. It's like interesting technical details for those of you who like technical details. They cannot handle triadic constraints. So if you have triadic constraints where you say, I don't want these two people to have a co-probability of sort of, there's various constraints that then the sort of like efficient sampling paradigm breaks down. So it's like, it's not obvious that this should work, but these marginal assignment probabilities are sort of okay. So the big cell that they gave, so you solve for assignment probabilities P, and then you sample a matching that respects those marginal probabilities. And so you get these sort of various probabilities. And then when they looked at this, so this was from offline data. This is just sort of like looking at data from ICLR 2018. As you decrease the cap, as you decrease the bounding probability, you sort of go down to 0.5. You have your sum similarity objective is still like 90% of 100%. Like it doesn't cost you that much. So you can actually like cap this probability and sort of like reduce the expected value of fraud quite a bit and not pay much in sum similarity is the pitch. And this is sort of because of a purely empirical property of peer review, which is that there's, fortunately, at least in ICLR, which is a conference on learning representations, a large ML machine learning conference, there's not just like one good reviewer for every paper, which is kind of an empirical property of the population of papers and reviews. Like there are a good number of good reviewers for every paper. So they implemented this on Open Review, which is one of the big platforms that's now used by NeurIPS and other people. And a number of conferences are now sort of like adding, you know, it's just a checkbox that you like run, you know, do you want to run standard sum similarity max flow, or do you want to sort of like protect fraud, like check, yes. So I knew Nihar from various contexts, and I had heard about this work, and I said, hey, you're adding randomness to a system. That means that we should be able to sort of like learn a lot of things about how to improve the design of that system, because I've been working on a variety of these problems. So when they were rolling out the pilot on Open Review, there were a couple conferences that they were working with. So I got involved in this evaluation paradigm. So one of the first conferences to use this, and I don't know if there's anybody who studies differential privacy in the room or online, but there's this small workshop, theoretical perspectives on differential privacy, TPDP. So they had sort of it's 95 submissions, 35 reviews. So it's 280, everything was triple reviewed. So it's 285 submission review pairs. That was sort of the first pilot that we ran. And then we were asked to also, or Nihar was asked to also do this, and then sort of we wrote IRB protocols for reviewing sort of out of Stanford, the human subject data. the big AAAI conference, which had 8,000 submissions. This is sort of like if you're not in computer science, you should be very scared by the scale of the peer review that happens. And if you are in computer science, you should also be very scared about the scale of peer review that happens. So this is 3,000 reviewers, 8,000 submissions. So the first year that they were using this randomized peer review, they were a little bit scared that they were going to mess up a very, very large conference. So you'll notice that only one of the reviewers was assigned at random. The other two were assigned using other procedures. There was actually like, I have this here, there was a senior reviewer. They guaranteed that every paper had a senior reviewer and at least one senior reviewer. They guaranteed that it was done in 2 rounds to try to reject some papers early to conserve resources. So it was actually like, turns out there are many ways that you can try to improve peer review. And this isn't ideal from the purpose of evaluating interventions because you're changing many things at once. So in this talk, I'm mostly going to focus on this TPDP reviewer because it requires example because it requires less assumptions. But the big question was like, okay, so your sum similarity only went down by 10%. What about like what's the actual effect on the quality of the reviews? So the outcome variable that we're interested in was sort of if you've done these types of reviews, you type the review, and in a lot of these systems, and in particular in open review, you self-report your confidence score, which is sort of like, feels like a very natural thing to maximize. Say, okay, like the sum similarity was based on bids and maximizing bids, but like which of these types of systems, maybe like people are overconfident. There are people bid in weird ways, and somehow maximizing, or like tracking the actual sort of like average self-reported expertise is sort of like a more valuable thing to maximize. So that we've also looked at like maximizing the length of reviews and like various outcomes that you might think would be other proxies for quality. So the first question we did was we looked at this sort of like a causal inference perspective on this question of like the cost of randomization. So as you randomize, sort of like how much worse is the average expertise? And so, so the x-axis here runs from 0.5 to 1, which is how much we're bounding the probability of any single assignment. And the y-axis is expertise, which is sort of a 5-point scale, but we're just looking at the average, so we're going to be pretty tightly around the sort of population average. And so when we run this evaluation, we're going to evaluate, it was run at 0.5. We're going to evaluate how much better do we think it would have been if we had gone up in Q. And sort of the red line is what happens sort of like with 0.5. It's just drawing a straight line out from 0.5. And we see that sort of like the off policy is that there's like a very little, so the error bars, I'll explain in a bit, but there's sort of like very slight gain from actually maximizing to the super duper deterministic optima of the sum similarity objective. This is sort of the first thing that just kind of validates what you see when you look at the curve of the sum similarity numbers, that things aren't measurably worse when you sort of like randomize. There turns out there's, rather than picking the 3 best reviewers for every paper, if you sample 3 from 6, the 3 from the top 6, you're getting sort of like good reviews. The confidence intervals here, this is sort of like these types of projects, at the high level, I'm describing something that's, it's just importance sampling, I'm doing reweighting. So there's a whole technical paper here about, we don't have point identification on the average, we have partial identification and interval estimate. And so these aren't confidence intervals, these are actually partial identification intervals that rely on either what are called Mansky bounds or Lipschitz assumptions. And I'm happy to talk about that offline, but there's a really fun math problem that we sort of like had to solve, which was, if you like math problems, it's fun. But essentially, for the purposes of interpreting this is sort of like, within some error that getting rid of the randomness wouldn't make things better. Right, so you're comparing to this sort of like plot of the reduction from 1 to 0.5, sort of like this 10% loss. But that was just sort of like a warm up really, because what we're really interested in asking, can we do the assignment better? What's the right score to sum up and try and maximize the sum of? In particular, I mentioned how like in these systems, you're typically bidding. Well, for those of you who've used OpenReview or some of the sort of TPMS, the CMT system run by Microsoft, some of the more advanced systems, they all increasingly have these things where you upload a set of your papers, and natural language processing, reads your papers, and then every time a submission comes in, there's sort of like a similarity score between your expertise and the paper. And one of the things that these systems do is they don't just listen to the bids. You actually are more likely to get a paper if you've published papers that are similar to the submitted paper. And one of the goals is it's sort of a backstop against people who don't bid. But it's also sort of like, yeah, you want to review that, but are you really an expert? There's sort of like a check. And so TPDP, like many systems, this is sort of the default inside the standard max flow version. It does a 50-50 weighting of those two parts. Like there's the bid and there's the text similarity. And so because things are randomized, we can say like, well, we're currently maximizing the 50-50 sum, but what would happen if we tried to maximize only the text similarity, forget about bids? So here we're going to kind of go for deterministic policies. We're using the randomized policy, but we're looking at deterministic policies that vary how much weight we put on the text similarity. Where sort of we ran it was run at 50-50. And again, looking at expertise. And we see that actually sort of putting more weight on text similarity, in fact, full weight on text similarity, would lead to sort of quite significant on the scale of sort of moving the average by 0.3, sort of would lead to better reviews, sort of higher confidence reviews. So if you're a program chair and you're running a conference on OpenReview or some similar platform, know that bids are pretty noisy. Focus on text similarity if you're sort of playing with those hyperparameters. And I mean, this is sort of a narrow lane of contribution, but I think it's very, very, very concrete that we're able to sort of remove some of the magic from magic numbers inside one of these systems that we face all the time. So I'd like to open with this example because a lot of us spend many, many hours a week dealing with variations on peer review. And the fact that these systems are now randomized, we can sort of use that to sort of set these numbers relatively intelligently, sort of in principled ways. Any questions about these ideas or the ideas in play here? Yeah.
So you're maximizing the sum of the bits, so you're solving max problem. But sometimes some people have argued that you should have different objectives, like maximize the minimum bid or expertise for a paper. Would that work?
Great. Yeah. So that's a great question. So maximizing the average sum, sort of what does that lead to the distribution of sort of the fairness considerations. Maybe you should make sure that every paper has at least one confident reviewer, which is sort of more of a mini-max assignment procedure. There's fair bid is a paper that was written a few years ago. So that is a optimization problem that leads to sort of I think you can constrain that with these essentially linear constraints and solve it relative just as well. And importantly, you can evaluate it as an alternative policy because the reviews that would happen there, many of them did happen under the randomized assignment, and you do a reweighting. We haven't done that, but we have it as a ... and you could also. So we've I don't think that fair bid is implemented in OpenReview, and that's one of the reasons. It was just one of those things where you have to code it up just to test it. Yeah, that's exactly sort of the broader space of sort of policies. We can make this comparison of okay, this is great. What does it map to in terms of moving average expertise? Now, average expertise might also not be the outcome that you're interested in because you might think that it's more relevant that everyone gets at least one high expertise review. It's unfair to say you're going to go mini-max and then evaluate on average. You're probably going to do worse because maximizing average. And then you actually stumble into this problem that causal inference is very good at averages and not very good at other things. So that's a little bit trickier. So we know how to do apples to apples of that policy on this measure, but that's not fair to it. So that was sort of like one of the reasons. I'm like remembering online why we didn't do it.
So you would need some extreme value theory or some other things to help you.
Yeah, so when you're estimating an average of outcomes, you sort of are relying on sort of some version of a central limit theorem for just like the average, the sample average and the sort of like the full sum that you ideally want to be estimating. And you need to have a better characterization of the distribution in order to talk about sort of like, extreme value, sort of like tail properties for sure. Yeah. So that's where you get like fun math problems that come up, and then you get to solve those and feel motivated that there's a real problem. Any other questions about this?
I wonder how the expertise on that part is measured.
So this is an average across the reviewers, and so, but it's a weighted average. So every person has responded on a 5-point scale, where they said, "Oh, I'm not very confident," or "Yes, I'm an expert on this." This is sort of the center question, and then what's happening in the regular on policy, it's just kind of like the mean value across the reviews. But then the off policy, it's reweighted based on the probability that that assignment would have happened in the other policy. So some things get a higher weight because they were likely to happen, they were very likely to happen in the other policy, and some things get a lower weight because they were unlikely to happen. And so you get, things go up when you've like made things that were good more likely, if that makes sense.
Was it derived by using like important sampling?
It's exactly important sampling, and the if you're interested in the details, sort of like when things get messy is that some probabilities go to 0, and you really want to know that value, but in your new policy it had a probability of 0, and so those are called positivity violations in the causal inference literature, and that's when you require partial identification. So you say, "Oh, I didn't get to see that value. Not only did I not see it, I couldn't have seen it. So it's censored. And so then you have to bound the contribution of that term to the sum they're trying to evaluate, which is called partial identification. And you can either do that by saying that the outcome is bounded or that there's some smoothness assumptions. And there's some fun math problems there.
So, I mean, I think it's super interesting, but what did the conferences say in the end? Because actually the review, I mean, first of all, expertise is not necessarily a good quality score. And then there's also this incentive kind of mechanism. I'm part of the program committee because I want to see new interesting papers. I don't want to review based on my expertise 10 years ago. See what I mean? So there's an incentive if I cannot bid. I might not be so interested in reviewing next year because I didn't get papers that were interesting. I mean, did you?
That's a great. So the analysis that we did for AAAI 2022 fed into the way that they configured some of the parameters for AAAI 2023. It wasn't quite this clean that like bids don't matter. And we actually, no one ever raised that point. The second point you made is sort of like new to me. This idea that, well, the reason why I want to bid is because I want to put momentum on the type of literature that I'm reading. That's a great point. I have no answer. I mean, I think that it's sort of like, I rarely will advocate for just like wholesale taking an analysis and like picking the optima and moving on. It's sort of like expose the data to the stakeholders and let them make the decision. But the sort of like the more careful evaluation of the cost of randomness was something that they were very interested in because they were worried that there were sort of like, you know, does AAAI actually have support? Is there broad knowledge? Because it's such a big conference that maybe there aren't 6 good reviewers for every paper. And we had a similar finding there that the randomness doesn't cost you anything.
All right, cool.
And one other thing is that some of these are like small effects. We also did things where we evaluated like bad matchings. And we said, like, what happens if you just like pick the 3 worst out of 6? Because that's what we had support for. And there you get like pop, like you get like a large effect size. And so like the biggest ticket heading I can say is like optimization is better than not optimization. Ultimately, these are like all kind of optimized systems.
So, and also, did you think about how to adjust the level of randomness from year to year? I mean, say now here you would like to tweak towards text-based weights, but you don't want to go to 1, maybe? Okay, you want to... but next year again, you want to keep some randomness because you didn't find for sure the optimal answer. Do you think about this, or could you reduce the level of randomness next year? Because
yeah, so this wasn't exactly the plot for AAAI, but for this workshop. So this is the sort of like the effect of randomness. And there's this kind of quirky thing that is slightly mathematical, but when Q is exactly 1/2, you essentially, there's a very simple algorithm that runs quickly for finding sort of like, you basically find two sets of matchings and you kind of like that you can respect the marginals because of things about permutation matrices that I won't go into. So 0.5 is computationally convenient on the sample side, but it essentially means that you're always getting 3 of 6 in a funny way. And if you go to like 0.48, you get that the constraints push probability to more reviewers. So instead of just being able to satisfy marginal probability of 0.5 by just having exactly twice as many, you get sort of like more distributed fractional solutions to the LP by getting off of 0.5. So one thing that we have done is said like, hey, in order to learn more things, let's go to like 0.4, I think 0.45 or something like that. So there were certain things like that, that once we had established that it wasn't costly, we were like, let's bring it down even a little bit more in order to sort of like be able to learn more things in future years. So there's been a slight sort of like learning to learn loop there. Yeah. I want to spend at least 10 minutes on this second problem, just to sort of like get the like diversity of ideas, and then I'll do a lightning round on school choice. So this is another problem. No, a green dot fell off the graph. This is another problem which is related, that I've spent a lot of time working on, which is closely related to influence maximization in social networks, but it's a very empirical take on it. So how do you target individuals in social networks to maximize the adoption of a technology? This is the classic visual for these types of studies. Nicholas Christakis' group at Yale has done a lot of this field work where they're sort of like looking to maximize, they're giving out multivitamins and trying to maximize how many people take multivitamins. I like to sort of include a photo of like, this is what a real village looks like. This is one of the study villages in Honduras. And this is the social network for that village. But essentially you're asking like, pick 2 people, you want to maximize the adoption of the product. And different sets of people lead to different, number of people who adopted, and different strategies for how you select people lead to different sets. And so the question is sort of like, what's the mapping from strategies to outcomes? And there's 3 major studies over the last 10 years in this literature, 4. I'll talk about the 4th a bit. So Kim et al. Was from the Christakis group. This was 32 villages in Honduras, and they were looking at water purification tablets and multivitamins, and they were trying to maximize the number of households that adopted it, and they were seeding at typically like 5 to 10 households. Tsai et al. Is this study in rural China where they looked at 150 villages, they mapped the full social networks, and they took information about the farmer's insurance. Sorry, the treatment was, hey, farmer, weather insurance is this great thing. Like, let me explain sort of like financial risk to you. It's sort of an economic intervention. And the outcome was how many households took on weather insurance. The idea being that sort of like, and also they were interested in that the effect of weather insurance is largest in informal economies that don't have access to traditional credit markets. But it's basically an intervention where they're hoping that as many people in the village adopt. Pollock et al., this is the country of New Jersey, the emerging economy of New Jersey in America, 56 schools. They took, within these schools, half of them, they went in and trained a group of 10 to 15 students on anti-bullying. So they sort of like sat them down in a room and said like, let's talk about sort of like psyche of the classroom. And then they were looking at, at the end of the school year, how many conflicts had happened. And the point is that in each of these studies, they were actually doing, or this one's a little more complicated, but essentially they were doing random targeting and looking at like the effect of these interventions. And a bunch of great ideas that we've learned about social networks tell us that there's other ways to target that are random, but sort of like biased towards high degree people. Here's this fourth study by Ahmed Mushfiq Mubarak's group. So can network-based targeting increase technology adoption? Great question. If you've ever written an academic paper with a question mark in the title, you know that if it's a question in the title, the answer is probably no. Because if the answer was yes, the title would be, network theory-based targeting can increase technology adoption. But basically, this was in Malawi. This was 200 villages in Malawi, and they were looking at 4 different ways to intervene. But it's similarly sort of trying to evaluate these ideas of using networks. And so this is sort of a slide that has some familiarity to a number of people in this room. So, if you're really trying to solve the maximization problem, you would say, well, give me a social network and some influence model that I believe, and I want to select, k individuals that maximize the spread of that of the diffusion under that influence model. And this is NP hard, but it's approximable, 1 minus 1 over E. It's one of these sort of celebrated results. And there is a history here where there's sort of like, in the social science literature, like Krockart's idea of structural leverage, there was sort of like floating in the literature for about a decade before it was formalized into an optimization problem. And a big part of this is that it's optimization under a model. So there's modern literature on robust influence maximization. That's all quite interesting. But here we're sort of like going to go totally model free and just look at, we have a population of villages where things landed at random. Let's look at sort of like, let's reweight that data and try to evaluate other policies and just look at sort of like no model in a model free way. So what are the strategies that we're interested in? Rather than doing deterministic influence maximization, we're going to do sort of like, okay, random targeting, that's the baseline. That's like picking random sets of people. One-hop targeting selects a random set of people and then selects asks them all to nominate one friend. So this uses the friendship paradox, if you've heard of this. This is the idea that your friends have more friends than you. Doing this sort of is a biased way to sort of like biases your sample of the population towards people who are more connected. Sounds like a good idea. There's other strategies. I'm going to focus on this because it's sort of like one of the favorite children of people who study social networks. And we're sort of going to compare it to random targeting. A little bit about the friendship paradox. It's a fascinating thing. I've been studying it for a long time. So this was from a paper that I wrote in 2011, looking at Facebook. There's a sort of theorem formulation of the friendship paradox, but there's also empirical questions. So on Facebook, 93% of people have less friends than the average of their friends. So it's like very, the vast majority of people have this experience. 84% of users have less friends than the median of their friends. This is important because averages are typically driven by outliers. So this is a plot of sort of like how many friends you have on Facebook and sort of like how many friends your friends have on average. So if you have 200 friends, your friends have 400 friends. If you have 600 friends, your friends have 700 friends, etc. So the friendship paradox has been used for outbreak detection. It's been as an idea, it's been sort of talked a lot about for vaccination strategies, vaccinating people who are more connected. Turns out for COVID, not that useful. For COVID, it was useful to vaccinate old people. There was like metadata, like you didn't need the network. There was sort of like metadata that told us like who was most exposed. There's some studies that use this. And the question of seeding is how to spark a spreading process, typically social processes. This is Christakis and Fowler 2010 is like the famous study that shows that the friendship paradox kind of like works. So the big point here is that when you go into a social network and you're going to pick 2 people, if you're picking 2 people at random, it's like k choose 2 equal probability of picking any set of size 2. But if you look at the probabilities of getting a certain set under the friendship paradox, it's very skewed, where the red set is way more probable than the green set. So this is sort of like what's the probability of a given set. So like the red, like here's these 2 central people, high degree. This is like the mode, like the most likely set to get. And then sort of like, connected corner sets are just like very unlikely. And that seems really good for spreading something on a network. You sort of like, you didn't have to solve the influence maximization problem. You just kind of like selected a biased sample. It's biased towards well-connected people. And what we want to estimate is sort of like the difference of the expected values of under two strategies. This is sort of like the one equation I have in the talk, but it's sort of like you're selecting a random set, you're looking at how many people adopted, and these are two different expectations under two different distributions. There's the uniform distribution, flat. There's the skewed distribution. And all the data is collected under this, and we're trying to estimate this based on importance sampling. And that turns out to basically work. It's largely vanilla importance sampling. There's sort of a central limit theorem for a superpopulation estimand, sort of like details of statistics that I won't go into. Yeah, so in these three different settings, it turns out that, right, they basically, here it's a more complicated design, but they basically were doing random targeting or doing random targeting with a control group. And so Betsy Levy-Pollock, who ran this study, when we reached out to her for this data, she said, I ran a field experiment for 2 years where we were trying to evaluate the effect of this. And now you're telling me that you can just use my data to like evaluate more hypotheses. Like here, like let me help you get access to my data. She was just like a gold star collaborator. And here's the, I'm going to sort of speed run the findings. When you look at the psi data, targeting people with the one-hop strategy leads to less adoption of the farmer's weather insurance. This is sort of like, I collaborate with statisticians, so we compute confidence intervals in multiple ways. But doing this intervention, if it was done at random, if it had been done with one-hop targeting, there would have been less weather insurance adopted. You look at the Pollock data, if you had picked people for these interventions, picked more central people, there would have been more conflict than random targeting. So I'm like slowing down now because this is like a counterintuitive finding. This was like not what we were expecting. We were hoping to get like sort of like causal inference evidence of friendship targeting working. Why doesn't one-hop targeting beat random in the two settings that we've studied so far? I have like one strong answer and two speculations. One is that random targeting is a worthy adversary. Random targeting actually does a really good job of spreading things out. And maybe one-hop targeting pushes things too much to the middle, and like being diverse as a set is good. Central people may cluster. Speculation, more connected people might not be so influential in a subtle way, or they also might not be so susceptible. So you end up reaching these well-connected people and they're like much harder to convince because they get approached all the time. This is sort of like a well-known trade-off that more influential people are harder to convince. Here you're doing something for free, but it's just sort of like, they might just be like the wrong people, or like the popular kids in school are not a good place to do an intervention for anti-bullying. And the reason that we're saying that is that when it did happen at random, so those schools got more weight, then those, when we put more weight on situations where we selected high degree people, we saw like less effect, like less reduction in bullying. Bigger question is like, maybe we have the wrong network. So right now we're looking at this data from that Arun Chandrasekhar kindly provided a bunch of extra data on. He's an economist at Stanford. So this was this gossip study where they actually collected 7 different social networks. And we're looking at sort of like, this is the correlation of the different networks. Sort of here's the kinship network is very different than most other questions. But the question is like, maybe you should be doing friendship targeting on the kinship network, or like only on the advice network, or the lending network, sort of like trying to understand like what's the right network. This is available for 71 villages. And basically the hope here is that sort of like getting beyond this like theoretical understanding that like one-hop targeting should work, and we actually like evaluate it from the fact that random targeting is random. And we can harvest that randomness to learn things about adjacent policies. I'm going to sort of skip school choice, but the point is that households have preferences, but schools have random preferences. So actually there's this distribution of what school you get assigned to Josh Angrist has this great work looking at like the causal effect of going to certain schools by looking at families that were likely to go to a certain school but did or didn't. We're currently working with the city of San Francisco to look at the effect of how they could tune like how much priority they give siblings, how much priority they give neighborhoods in order to sort of like improve the outcomes, which is sort of like it's a wicked problem to work on in the formal sense of wicked problem, which is this old operations research term. It's very, very complicated to work with policymakers. Essentially my pitch is that these complex systems that have randomized algorithms, there's this opportunity for self-improvement. I sort of like would love to hear more examples because I'm trying to sort of like organize some thinking around this at like the higher level of just these one-off projects I've been involved in. Randomness helps us understand the consequences of systems, but also sort of like improve their design. And maybe we should increase randomness, but I'm unwilling to say it. Thank you.